The moment Lavinia Dawson stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, the wind stole her hat and sent it tumbling straight into the broad chest of the most rugged, sun-weathered cowboy she had ever laid eyes on. And she knew, even then, that the Kansas plains were going to change her life in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. She pressed her hand to her bare head and squinted against the bright April sun, watching the stranger catch her hat with one easy motion, his fingers curling around the brim as though he had been standing there for precisely that purpose. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples beneath his own dust-colored hat, and his eyes, when he finally looked up at her, were the deep amber brown of creek water in late summer. He had the kind of face that had spent years under open sky, honest and lined at the corners, though he could not have been older than 30. There was a quietness about him, a stillness that reminded Lavinia of the prairies she had been watching through the stagecoach window for the past 2 days, vast and unreadable, and somehow deeply calm. He walked the few steps toward her and held out her hat with both hands. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the way a river sounds when it has nowhere urgent to be. Lavinia took the hat and set it back on her head, tucking a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. She was 24 years old, and she had come to Caldwell from a life in Missouri that had grown too small and too sorrowful to stay inside. Her mother was gone. Her father had remarried a woman who looked through Lavinia as though she were made of window glass. And the man she had once thought she might love had chosen someone with a larger inheritance and a quieter disposition. Lavinia had answered a newspaper advertisement for a schoolteacher in Caldwell, packed 2 trunks, and climbed aboard a westbound stage without looking back once. "Thank you," she said, and offered him the only smile she had left after 2 days of bad road and dust. "The wind here seems to have very definite opinions." The corner of his mouth lifted. "It does, especially in April." He touched the brim of his own hat. "Homer Ramsey. I run cattle out on the Cimarron Flats." "Lavinia Dawson. I am to be the new schoolteacher at the Caldwell schoolhouse." Something shifted in his expression, a small warmth that traveled from his mouth to his eyes. "They have been waiting on a teacher for nearly 4 months. The children will be glad." He paused. "The whole town will be glad, I expect." The stagecoach driver was already pulling down her trunks and setting them with a graceless thump on the packed dirt of the main street, and the town of Caldwell sprawled around her in the way that cow towns always did, loud and purposeful and slightly dangerous, with cattlemen moving along the boardwalks and the distant sound of livestock from the holding pens south of town. Caldwell sat right on the edge of Indian Territory, a place where the cattle trails from Texas converged before pushing north, and even in its rough-hewn state it had a vitality that surprised her, something alive and urgent running just beneath the surface of every transaction and conversation. Homer Ramsey did not linger. He touched his hat brim again in farewell, and moved on down the street with the long, easy stride of a man entirely comfortable with the ground beneath his feet. Lavinia watched him go for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then gathered herself and set about finding the boarding house where she had arranged to stay. The boarding house was run by a woman named Edna Pryor, who was 60 years old, built like a fence post, and possessed of an opinion on every subject under the Kansas sun. She showed Lavinia to a room on the 2nd floor that had a window facing east and a cotton quilt on the bed that smelled of cedar and something faintly floral. "You will hear the cattle drives from here on still nights," Edna said, smoothing the quilt with a proprietary hand. "Some women find it lonesome. I find it cheerful. Means commerce is moving." Lavinia set her smaller bag on the chair and looked out the window at the street below. "I expect I shall find it cheerful too," she said, though she was not entirely certain yet what she would find anything. The schoolhouse was a single-room building on the north end of town, freshly whitewashed earlier that spring by the town council in anticipation of her arrival. It had 12 wooden desks, a pot-bellied stove that would be necessary come autumn, a chalkboard that had seen better years, and a small desk at the front for Lavinia herself. She spent her first full day in Caldwell arranging the room, writing her name in careful letters on the chalkboard, and trying to make the space feel welcoming to the 22 children who would arrive on Monday morning. It was the Saturday of her first week in Caldwell that she crossed paths with Homer Ramsey again, and this time it was not by accident of wind. She had gone to Whitfield's general store to purchase chalk and a few personal items, and she was standing at the counter waiting while old Mr. Whitfield disappeared into the back storeroom, when the door opened behind her and Homer came in with a list folded in his hand, and his hat pushed back on his head in the way men do when they are not thinking about how they look. He stopped when he saw her, and for just a beat, neither of them spoke. "Miss Dawson," he said, "settling in well." "Reasonably well, thank you," she said. "The room is comfortable and Mrs. Pryor has strong opinions about breakfast, which I find reassuring." He laughed at that, a real laugh, short and genuine, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and lighter, like the sun had come out from behind a cloud. "Edna Pryor's opinions about breakfast have saved more than one cattle hand from a cold morning," he said. "She is something of a legend in this county." "I can believe it." Lavinia turned slightly to face him more directly. "Are you in town long?" "Just for supplies. We are moving a herd north next week, and I need to be back out on the flats by tomorrow evening." He glanced at his list and then back at her. "How are the children? Monday is the first day, is that right?" "It is. I confess I am a little nervous, though I taught for 2 years in Missouri before coming here. Children are the same everywhere, I think, but a new place always carries its own particular customs." "The children here are good," he said with a directness that was not boastful, just matter of fact. "Tough country grows tough kids, but they are kind, most of them. You will find your footing quickly." Mr. Whitfield returned with her chalk and set it on the counter, and the brief pocket of conversation closed around itself. Homer moved to the far end of the counter to place his order, and Lavinia paid for her items and said goodbye with a quiet pleasantness that she hoped concealed how reluctant she was to walk back out into the bright morning alone. Monday arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, and Lavinia's 22 students arrived in various states of cleanliness and enthusiasm, ranging from a tiny girl named Rosie Albright, who was 5 years old and pressed a wildflower into Lavinia's hand the moment she crossed the threshold, to a 12-year-old boy named Del Pryor, Edna's grandson, who slouched in the back row with his arms crossed and a look that suggested he planned to be very difficult. By the end of the first week, Del Pryor was sitting in the front row because he could not stop raising his hand when Lavinia asked questions about history, and Rosie Albright had appointed herself Lavinia's personal assistant. Lavinia wrote home to no one in particular, because there was no one in Missouri who would care to read her letters, and instead she began a journal in which she set down her observations about Caldwell with the careful attention of someone who intends to love a place and wants to remember the beginning of it. Homer Ramsey came back to town 3 weeks later. She saw him from the schoolhouse window, which she had left open to the warm May air, as he rode in from the south on a red-brown horse with a white blaze on its nose. He was with 2 other ranch hands, and they were all coated in the particular pale dust of the trail. But even from a distance, there was something in the way he sat his horse that was unmistakable, a kind of unhurried authority that had nothing to do with self-importance and everything to do with a man being exactly where he was meant to be. She told herself she noticed him purely out of the natural curiosity of someone still learning the patterns of a new town. She told herself this several more times over the following days, which perhaps indicated that she did not entirely believe it. It was Edna Pryor who first put into plain language what Lavinia was working very hard not to think about clearly. They were sitting on the boarding house porch one evening after supper, the sky going gold and rose above the flat horizon, when Edna set down her mending and looked at Lavinia with the direct, unadorned gaze of a woman who has outlasted enough politeness to see straight through it. "Homer Ramsey has been asking about you," Edna said. Lavinia kept her eyes on the horizon. Has he? He asked Gus Whitfield whether the schoolteacher was settling in. He asked Doc Hennessy if the boarding house was adequate. Edna picked her mending back up. He did not ask me because he knows I would have told you immediately, which is precisely the information that kept him from asking. Lavinia laughed in spite of herself. He is simply being neighborly. Homer Ramsey has been neighborly to this town for 5 years, Edna said placidly. He has never before asked Gus Whitfield about any specific resident's welfare. The following Saturday, Homer appeared at the schoolhouse door in the late afternoon, when Lavinia was still inside grading her students' arithmetic exercises. She heard his boots on the porch step and looked up to find him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was, she had come to understand, his version of being formal. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all. Come in." She set down her pencil. He came in and looked around the room with a kind of quiet appreciation, taking in the alphabet that she had written in careful letters around the top of the walls, the drawings the younger children had done that she had pinned above the windows, the tidy rows of desks. "You have made it a real classroom," he said. "It looked like a storage room when Thompson was teaching here." "Mr. Thompson left, did he?" "Last fall. Couldn't take the winters, I think. Some people can't." He looked at her then with the directness that she was beginning to recognize as simply his way. "Can you take winters?" "I have never run from cold weather yet," she said. Something in his expression settled, as though a small but important question had been answered. He turned his hat in his hands once and then said, "I was wondering if you might like to ride out to the Cimarron tomorrow. The wild plums are blooming along the creek and it is worth seeing. I could have you back by supper time." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. There was nothing in his face but honest invitation and a patience that seemed entirely comfortable waiting for whatever answer she chose to give. "I would like that," she said. He smiled, and it was the same smile from the general store, the one that changed the whole geography of his face. "I will bring 2 horses," he said, "and something for lunch." He brought 2 horses as promised, a calm-natured bay mare for her alongside his own red-brown gelding, whose name, she learned, was Biscuit, which struck her as deeply endearing for a horse of such considerable dignity. He had packed saddlebags with bread, cold roasted chicken, a jar of last summer's peach preserves, and 2 tin cups for the creek water, which he told her was clean enough to drink in spring. The ride south from Caldwell took them through rolling grassland that rippled in the warm breeze like the surface of a great shallow sea, and Lavinia, who had grown up in Missouri where the land was more wooded and contained, felt something open in her chest at the sight of that immense sky pressing down all around the horizon. She understood for the first time why the people who loved this country loved it the way they did, not in spite of its bareness but because of it, because under that sky there was nowhere to hide and nothing to hide from, and there was a kind of freedom in that. Homer rode beside her without pressing conversation, which she appreciated. He pointed out things as they came to them. A red-tailed hawk perched on a fence post, the tracks of a fox in a soft patch of ground, the exact place where the grass changed color from the paler green of the upland to the deeper, darker green near the creek bed. He knew this land the way a man knows a person he loves, in the particular details, in the small things that most people would pass without noticing. When they reached the Cimarron, the wild plum trees were exactly as he had promised, crowded white with blossom along the banks, and the scent of them came to her on the breeze like something from a garden she had never been to but somehow remembered. She stopped her horse without thinking about it and simply looked, and behind her she heard Homer stop too. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yes," he agreed. They ate lunch in the shade of a cottonwood near the water, sitting on a blanket he had rolled behind his saddle, and the conversation came easily and without contrivance, the way conversation does between 2 people who are genuinely interested in one another without yet knowing how to say so. She told him about Missouri, about her mother who had died of fever when Lavinia was 17, about teaching school in a small town where she had known everyone her whole life, and where everyone had known exactly what kind of woman she was supposed to become. He listened without rushing her, and without offering the kind of sympathetic noise people make when they are waiting for you to finish. He told her about the cattle operation he ran on the Cimarron Flats, 400 head of longhorns that he had started with 150 after buying out a partner who wanted to go back to Tennessee. He had come west from Kentucky in 1872 at the age of 23, following the cattle trade north from Texas, and had settled in Kansas because the land spoke to him in a way that Kentucky never quite had. He had no family left to speak of, a brother in Louisville he wrote to twice a year and who wrote back once. "Do you miss home?" she asked him. He considered it with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. "I miss who I was when I was there," he said finally. "Not the place itself. The place is just geography. It is the person you were in it that you miss." He looked at her sidelong. "Does that make sense?" "It makes a great deal of sense," she said quietly. They rode back to Caldwell in the long gold light of early evening, and Homer walked her horse to the boarding house hitching post and helped her down in the formal way, holding her hand and steadying her elbow, though she was quite capable of dismounting on her own. She let him do it because his hands were warm and careful, and because there was something in the gesture that felt like the beginning of something she was not ready to name yet. "Thank you," she said, "for the plum trees." "They bloom again next spring," he said, and then seemed to realize what he had implied, that there would be a next spring for both of them together in some version, and he looked at her with a kind of quiet hoping that was more eloquent than anything else he might have said. She went inside and stood in her room for a long time looking out the east window at the darkening sky, and she thought that she was in a great deal of trouble, in the best possible way. The weeks that followed built themselves into a rhythm that Lavinia came to look forward to in the way she looked forward to the first cup of coffee in the morning, not as a luxury, but as a necessary and organizing pleasure. Homer came to town on Saturdays when he could, and they developed the habit of walking together in the evenings along the South Road where it opened out onto the grassland, talking about everything and nothing with the ease of two people who have discovered they are, at their cores, made of compatible material. June brought heat, and the sound of cattle and the smell of trail dust that lay over Caldwell like a fine gauze, because the town was busy, sitting as it did at the intersection of the cattle trails and the border of Indian Territory, and the commerce of it was constant and occasionally rough. There were saloons along the main street that Lavinia gave a wide berth, not from priggishness but from practicality, and there were lawmen who wore their badges with varying degrees of conviction, and there were the ordinary people of the town who woke each day and went about the business of living with the quiet heroism that ordinary life always requires. Homer had come to town one Friday evening and was waiting for her outside the schoolhouse when she finished her week's last lesson. She saw him leaning against the fence post with his arms folded and his hat pulled down against the afternoon glare, and her heart did something she had stopped trying to pretend it did not do. "You are early," she said. "I rode faster," he said simply. They walked the South Road as they usually did, and the conversation drifted and settled as it always did, but there was something different in the air that evening, something that had been building through the weeks of Saturday walks and shared lunches and long conversations on Edna Pryor's porch, where Edna very pointedly found reasons to be elsewhere. Homer stopped walking. The sun was halfway down the sky ahead of them, and the grassland ran away from them in every direction, gold and green and endless, and somewhere far to the south a nighthawk was calling. "Lavinia," he said, and something in the way he said her name made her turn to face him fully. "I am not a man who is good at saying things in a roundabout way, so I am going to say this directly, and I hope you will forgive me if it is too soon." She waited. "I think about you constantly," he said. "When I am on the range and there is nothing in any direction but grass and sky, I think about what you would say about it, what you would notice that I would miss because I have stopped seeing it. I think about your voice and the way you laugh, and the way you argued with me last week about the best route through the Osage Hills, as though you had been traveling these plains your whole life." He looked at her with those amber-brown eyes that had been honest since the first moment she met them. "I have not felt this way before. I wanted you to know." The nighthawk called again in the distance. The grass moved. "Homer," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which was something she was quietly proud of. "I came here planning to spend my life teaching other people's children and making a small but sufficient life for myself, and I was entirely at peace with that plan." She paused. "And then the wind took my hat." He looked at her for a moment, and then that smile came, the one that changed everything, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his gently, as though she were something he intended to take very good care of. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission." "You have my permission," she said, "though you have been courting me for 6 weeks already in case that escaped your notice." He laughed and she laughed, and the grassland held them in its enormous, indifferent palm, and the sky went slowly gold above them. And it was, Lavinia thought, the best moment she had lived since she could remember. The summer deepened around them, and so did everything between them. Courtship in Caldwell in 1879 had its own particular grammar. Sunday church attendance and afternoon visits with Edna Pryor present as chaperone, who read her Bible with the aggressively casual air of someone demonstrating that she was absolutely not listening. It had shared suppers at the boarding house and the occasional social at the town hall, where Homer danced with the stolid determination of a man who has never pretended to be graceful, but is unwilling to disappoint his partner, and Lavinia danced with him anyway and loved him for it. Because that was the word she understood by midsummer, the plain and irreducible word that she had been circling for weeks. She loved him. She loved his quietness and his directness, and the way he listened with his whole body turned toward her, the way he noticed small things on the land and in the sky, the way he spoke to his horses with the same easy respect he gave to people, the way he looked at her as though she were a discovery he intended to spend the rest of his life studying. She had not said it yet, and neither had he, but it lived in every conversation and every walk and every evening on the porch, patient and enormous, waiting for the right moment to be put into words. That moment arrived in late July. There had been trouble in town that week. A group of Texas drovers had come through with a contentious temperament and too much whiskey, and had spent 2 nights making themselves unpleasant in ways that ranged from loud to briefly dangerous. One of them, a man with a bad reputation that had apparently traveled north ahead of him, had gotten into a dispute with a local merchant, and things had turned ugly in the street outside the general store on Thursday afternoon. Homer had been in town that day, and he had stepped in with the calm, unhesitating authority of a man who is not looking for a fight but is entirely unafraid of one, placing himself between the drover and the merchant with a steadiness that had caused the situation to deflate without violence. The marshal had arrived 2 minutes later to manage the formal resolution. Lavinia had seen it from the schoolhouse window. She had seen Homer walk back across the street afterward, as though nothing of particular note had happened, dusting his hands on his trousers and putting his hat back on with a decisive tap. She met him that evening on the porch with Edna conspicuously absent, and she looked at him for a long time before she said anything. "I saw what you did today," she said. "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing. You could have been hurt." "I was not going to be hurt," he said with that simple certainty that was both infuriating and deeply reassuring. "Homer." She took his hand, which she had never done first before, and felt his fingers close around hers immediately, warm and certain. "I love you." She said it clearly, without preamble, the way he always said what he meant. "I have loved you for quite some time, and I thought you should know." The stillness that came over him was the same stillness she had noticed on the very first day, that quality of the plains, vast and calm and full of something just under the surface. He looked at her, and she could see, quite clearly, that he had been waiting for this the way the grassland waits for rain, in complete and patient faith. "Lavinia," he said, and his voice was low and unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "I have loved you since the day you told the wind it had definite opinions." She laughed, and the sound of it broke whatever remaining formality had been holding the moment at a distance, and he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, fully present and entirely sincere, and the evening went golden around them. Edna Pryor appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later with a pitcher of lemonade and the satisfied expression of a woman whose predictions have come exactly true. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said. Homer proposed in September on a Sunday afternoon on the same stretch of the South Road where he had first told her how he felt. He had no ring with him because the ring he wanted to give her had to be ordered from a jeweler in Wichita and had not yet arrived, and he explained this with an apologetic directness that made her love him more than she had thought possible 5 minutes before. "I did not want to wait for the ring," he said. "I have already waited longer than felt reasonable." "Yes," she said, before he had finished asking the full question. He looked up at her from where he had gone down on one knee in the September grass. "I had not finished asking," he said. "I know," she said. "Yes, anyway." The ring arrived from Wichita 3 weeks later, a simple gold band with a small oval turquoise stone that was the color of the sky on clear mornings. And when Homer put it on her finger, she held her hand up and looked at it in the autumn light, and felt the particular, irreversible happiness of a life that has been changed for the better. They were married in November, in the Caldwell church, which was small and wood-framed and let in the cold through the window seams, so that the congregation wore their coats throughout the ceremony. Edna Pryor sat in the front row in her best dress and wept with the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who has been right about something important. Del Pryor, in the row behind his grandmother, sat with his arms uncharacteristically at his sides, and his chin lifted in an expression that on a 12-year-old boy could only be called solemn pride. Little Rosie Albright had insisted on bringing flowers, and though November in Kansas does not offer much in the way of fresh blooms, she had found a cluster of dried golden prairie grass and tied it with a blue ribbon, which Lavinia carried down the short aisle with all the ceremony it deserved. Homer stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which fit him well and which he wore with the slightly stiff dignity of a man in clothes that are not his natural element. And when Lavinia came through the door on her own arm, because there was no one to give her away and she did not require anyone to do so, he looked at her with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for. It was love, yes, but it was more than that. It was recognition, the particular look of a person seeing clearly the thing that their life had been quietly building toward all along. "You are beautiful," he said under his breath when she reached him. "You are excellent," she said back, and the minister cleared his throat with the mild exasperation of a man who has presided over enough weddings to know when his participation is the least important element. The winter was harsh and long, the way Kansas winters are, and Lavinia had not lied when she said she had never run from cold weather. She taught through January and February in her coat, with the pot-bellied stove working to its full capacity, and she and Homer settled into the life of the cattle ranch on the Cimarron Flats with the practical intimacy of two people who have chosen each other with open eyes. The ranch house was modest by Missouri standards, 2 rooms and a loft, but Homer had spent the autumn adding a proper bedroom and improving the kitchen, and it had the particular warmth of a place that has been lived in carefully and with intention. There was a window above the kitchen basin that looked west toward the Oklahoma Territory border, and in the mornings when Lavinia made coffee, she could watch the sun come up behind her and cast its long light across the plains ahead, and she thought that this was the best window she had ever stood at in her life. She still taught school, riding the 3 miles into Caldwell on the days the weather allowed and staying with Edna on the days it did not. The townspeople had received the marriage with the warm approval of a community that likes to see its good people happy, and Homer's standing in the county, already solid, was only improved by his wife's growing reputation as a teacher of real skill and dedication. Spring came again to the Cimarron Flats with the particular drama that the plains reserve for their seasonal transitions, the grass going green overnight it seemed, the sky broadening and deepening in color after the white and gray compression of winter, the wild plums blossoming again along the creek bank. Homer took her there in April, as he had promised, and they sat under the same cottonwood where they had eaten lunch the year before, and the world felt entirely different and entirely right. "1 year ago I did not know you existed," she said, leaning her back against his shoulder while the plum blossoms drifted past on the warm breeze. "2 years ago neither of us would have believed this was possible," he said, his arm around her. "That is worth thinking about." She thought about it. She thought about Missouri and the small life she had been building there, measured and predictable and safe, and she thought about a hat blowing in the wind and the hands of a cowboy who had never learned to say things in a roundabout way. The distance between those two lives was not measured in miles, she thought, but in something more essential, in the willingness to step off a stagecoach into unfamiliar air and trust the wind. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if I had not come?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet when he was actually considering something rather than just assembling a quick answer. "I think I would have been fine," he said honestly. "I had a good life here, but I would have been missing the best part of it without knowing it was missing. That is a particular kind of poverty." She turned to look at him. "That is a very beautiful thing to say." "I have my moments," he said with a straight face, and she laughed and pressed her forehead against his jaw. "The cattle business was good that year." Homer brought on 2 additional hands, brothers named Louis and Tomás Vargas from south of the border who knew cattle the way Homer knew the land. And the herd grew, and the work was constant and hard, but rewarding in the solid, tangible way that physical work with visible results always is. Louis and Tomás became fixtures of the ranch, eating supper at the big table Lavinia had insisted on buying from the Wichita furniture merchant who came through town in May. And the evenings on the ranch had the quality of a household that has found its natural population. Lavinia found herself in the late summer of 1880 with a particular knowledge that she shared with Homer on a Tuesday evening after supper when they were washing the dishes together in the companionable way they had developed, she washing, and he drying with the particular concentration of a man who takes even small tasks seriously. "We are going to have a child," she said, setting a tin plate in the rinse water. Homer set down his drying cloth. He looked at her with those amber eyes and she watched the information travel through him like a current, the slight widening of his eyes, the stillness, and then the slow, extraordinary smile that was better than any smile she had ever seen on any face. "Lavinia," he said. "I know," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face the way he had on the porch of Edna Pryor's boarding house when he had first kissed her, and he looked at her for a long moment as though taking very careful inventory of a thing he wanted to be sure he would always remember. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling entirely well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but entirely well." He kissed her and then held her for a long time by the kitchen window with the last of the summer evening light coming through, and somewhere out on the range, one of the longhorns was calling in that low, resonant way they had, and the prairie went on in every direction, enormous and accommodating. Edna Pryor's reaction to the news was to immediately begin knitting, producing blankets and small garments at a pace that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity for some time. Dell Pryor, now 13 and considerably less difficult, had the grace to look genuinely pleased. The ranch hands, Louis and Tomás, brought a small carved wooden horse from Louis's saddlebag the next morning and set it on the kitchen table without comment, which was all the comment it needed. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and Lavinia taught until February, when the combination of advancing pregnancy and February weather made the daily ride to Caldwell impractical. She spent the last 2 months of her pregnancy reading and writing, and managing the household with an efficiency that frustrated Homer somewhat, because he had appointed himself her primary caretaker, and she kept not needing caretaking. "I am perfectly capable of carrying wood," she told him for the third time on a February morning. "I know you are," he said, taking the wood from her arms without breaking stride. "I am carrying it anyway." The baby arrived in April, which felt, to Lavinia, entirely appropriate, in the same month the wild plums bloomed, in the month she had arrived in Caldwell, in the month that seemed, in the grammar of her new life, to belong to beginnings. It was a boy, born with Homer's dark hair and Lavinia's direct gaze, and they named him Thomas Elliot Ramsey, Thomas for Tomás Vargas, who had become, over the months, a member of the family in all the ways that mattered, and Elliot for Lavinia's maternal grandfather, who had been a schoolteacher in Virginia before the war and whose name she had carried in her heart since childhood. Homer held his son for the first time on a morning in early April, while the wind moved the new grass outside the bedroom window, and the expression on his face was one that Lavinia had no words for in any language. It was beyond happiness, beyond pride, into some territory that did not have a name yet, that had to be created fresh for the occasion. "Thomas Elliot," he said softly, looking down at the small face. "He has your nose," Lavinia said from the bed where she was resting against the pillows. "Poor boy," Homer said, and she laughed, which hurt but was worth it. Thomas Elliot Ramsey grew into the life of the Cimarron Flats ranch as naturally as the grass grew into spring, with an eagerness and a physical confidence that was entirely his father's, and a curiosity about everything and everyone that was entirely his mother's. By the time he was 2, he had an established friendship with both Vargas brothers, and could identify 7 different kinds of hawk by their silhouettes against the sky, which he pointed out to anyone who would stand still long enough to look up. The years between 1881 and 1884 were years of building, in the way that good marriages are always building, not toward some final completed state, but toward a deeper and more nuanced version of themselves. The ranch grew, and Homer's reputation in the county grew with it, not as a man who sought prominence, but as a man that other cattlemen came to when they needed someone whose judgment they could trust. Lavinia continued to teach, and her school grew, because Caldwell was growing, a cow town finding its way toward a more permanent kind of settlement as the cattle trade shifted, and the plains began, slowly, to be claimed in more lasting ways. She was aware of the larger changes moving through the territory, the way the Wild West was in the process of becoming something else, something more settled and less dangerous, and she thought, both better and lesser for that transformation. The Indian Territory to the south, where the cattle trails passed, was under a pressure that troubled her when she let herself think about it clearly. The men and women she saw sometimes at a distance, the Osage and the Cherokee and others living on the land that had been given to them, and then renegotiated, and then renegotiated again, carried with them a dignity and an injustice that she mentioned to Homer one evening after riding back from a school board meeting where someone had spoken casually about the territory, as though it were simply empty land waiting to be used. "It is not empty," she said, setting her gloves on the kitchen table with more force than the gloves required. "It has never been empty, the way people speak about it as though the people there are simply inconvenient." Homer looked at her from across the table with his steady gaze. "No," he said, "it is not empty. It never was." He paused. "I try to remember that the land we are on also had its first people. That does not resolve anything, but it is worth not forgetting." She loved him, she thought, in part because he did not turn away from the complicated things. He did not simplify what was not simple, did not pretend that the life they were building had no shadows in its history. He held the full truth of things and went on living with integrity within it, which was, she had come to believe, the best any person in any time could do. In the spring of 1884, something happened that rearranged several things at once. A man arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon, traveling north from the territory with a story that had the particular quality of truth that made it harder to hear than a lie would have been. His name was Edmund Bray, and he had been, by his own account, the business partner of Lavinia's father before her father had died the previous autumn of heart failure in Missouri. Lavinia had not known her father was dead. There had been no letter because the second wife had not thought to send one, or had not wanted to, which was perhaps the same thing. He was there for a legal reason. Lavinia's father had left her a piece of property in Missouri, a small farm outside of the town where she had grown up, and the second wife had been contesting it in a county court. And Mr. Bray had made it his business to travel to Kansas to inform Lavinia in person, because the letter he had sent 3 months prior had evidently not arrived. She sat with this information at the kitchen table for a long time after Mr. Bray had been fed and housed for the night in the ranch hand bunkroom. Homer sat across from her, not filling the silence, just present in the way he always was when she needed him to simply be there. "I did not know he was gone," she said finally. "I know," Homer said. "We were not close. After my mother died, he became a different person, or perhaps he always was that person and my mother's presence had kept some better version of him available, but he was still my father." "Yes," Homer said. She looked at him. "I do not need you to fix this," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I am just here." She went to Missouri in June, taking Thomas with her because he was 3 years old and she was unwilling to leave him for 6 weeks, and Homer rode with them as far as Wichita, where they caught the eastbound train. He held her on the station platform for a long time before she boarded, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, sun and leather, and the particular clean smell of a man who spends his days in open air. 6 weeks, she said. "I will count them," he said. Missouri was strange to her now, smaller and more closed than she remembered, the green more enclosed and the sky less available, and she understood with a finality that had not been possible to feel while she was still there that she had been entirely right to leave. She settled her father's estate with the help of a county lawyer and a steadfastness that surprised even herself, navigating the second wife's coldness with the particular dignity of a woman who has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. The farm was hers, and she sold it before she left, because she was not coming back, and the money from it she set aside in a Wichita bank for Thomas's future. She was back in Caldwell in 7 weeks rather than 6, because the business had gone more smoothly than expected, and she arrived on an afternoon stage to find Homer waiting at the station with Biscuit, and her bay mare saddled and Thomas's small carved wooden horse in Homer's coat pocket, which he had brought to give back to Thomas as a welcome home present, because the boy had been talking about it the whole trip. Thomas ran to his father the moment his feet hit the ground, and Homer caught him and swung him up in one motion, and over Thomas's delighted head Homer looked at Lavinia with the face of a man who has spent 7 weeks counting. "You are early," he said. "I rode faster," she said, using his own words, and he laughed and reached out his free arm, and she stepped into it without hesitation. Caldwell in the mid-1880s was changing with the particular urgency of a boom town that senses its own transition. The cattle drives from Texas had peaked and were beginning, slowly, to diminish as the barbed wire fences of homesteaders moved across the plains, and the long trail north became less practical and less necessary. The town was finding new identities to try on, more permanent commerce, more families, more churches and schools, and the quiet infrastructure of a place planning to stay. Lavinia's school had grown to 31 students, and she had requested, and received from the town council, a second teacher to assist with the younger grades, a young woman named Clara Finch who had come from Ohio with a teaching certificate, and an enthusiasm that Lavinia found both endearing and occasionally exhausting. Homer had seen the changes coming the way he saw weather, early and clearly and without alarm, and had been diversifying the ranch operation since 1882, adding horses to the cattle, building a reputation as a man who could train working horses to a standard that the Army outposts and the ranches across 3 counties had come to value. Luis Vargas had a particular genius for the horse training work, and the two of them had developed a partnership that made the Ramsey Ranch something rather more than the simple cattle operation it had started as. In the autumn of 1885, Lavinia told Homer that Thomas was going to have a sibling. He was in the paddock with a young horse when she came out to tell him, and he vaulted the fence with a lightness that a man of 36 had no particular right to, and he stood before her in the October afternoon light with the horse regarding them both with mild curiosity over the fence rail. "Again," he said, and his smile was enormous. "Again," she confirmed. "Thomas will be very official about it," he said. "He will appoint himself in charge of teaching the baby things." "He absolutely will," she said, and she was laughing, and he was laughing, and the horse tossed its head at the noise and stamped once, which seemed like an appropriate response. The second child arrived in May of 1886, a girl this time, whom they named Clara Ruth Ramsey, Clara for the young teacher who had become Lavinia's closest friend in the territory, and Ruth because Homer said it was a name that sounded like staying, which it did. Thomas, now 5, received his sister with the gravity of a child who has been told he has an important job and takes it seriously. He spent the first morning of her life sitting beside Lavinia's bed and explaining to the sleeping baby the names of the hawks that flew over the ranch. "That one," he said, pointing at the window, "is a Swainson's. They go south in the winter." The baby slept on. Thomas nodded as though she had responded appropriately. The life they were building together had by now the solidity of something that has been tested and found sound. There had been hard seasons. A drought year in 1883 that had cost them a fifth of the herd and several months of worry. A winter illness that had kept Lavinia coughing through February of 1884 and frightened Homer in a quiet, contained way that she only understood fully when he told her about it afterward. There had been the normal friction of 2 strong-willed people occupying a shared life, the occasional argument that was more about exhaustion than substance, the necessary work of learning when to speak and when to be silent, and when to simply make coffee and sit down together. But through all of it, the essential thing had not changed. He still looked at her the way he had on that stagecoach platform in April of 1879, with the full attention of a person who considers what they are looking at genuinely worth looking at. She still found him, in the middle of ordinary days, surprising and interesting in the way that only people who are genuinely themselves can remain surprising and interesting over years. In 1887, Homer made a decision that changed the shape of their life in a way that was significant and good. He bought the adjacent property to the north, 600 acres of grassland that had been worked briefly by a homesteader family who had found Kansas harder than they expected and had gone back to Indiana. The additional land gave him room to expand the horse operation substantially, and it also contained, in a shallow valley along a small tributary creek, a stand of cottonwoods and a spring that ran cold and clear all year. He brought Lavinia to see it on a Sunday in October when the cottonwood leaves were fully gold, and they stood in the valley with the leaves coming down around them in the still air and the spring running quietly at their feet, and Homer said, "I thought we might build a proper house here." She looked at the valley, at the spring and the cottonwoods and the way the land curved around it like a cupped hand. "Yes," she said, "exactly here." They broke ground in the spring of 1888, and Homer oversaw the construction with the same patient attention he brought to everything, making no compromise on the solidity of the foundation or the quality of the lumber, accepting input from Lavinia on every detail of the interior, with a respect for her vision that the contractor found slightly unusual but which Homer treated as the simple logic it was, since she would be living in it as much as he would. The house took a year, and they moved in during the spring of 1889, 2 months after Lavinia discovered that the family was going to grow again. The new house was everything the old one had not had room to be. There were 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen with 2 windows looking out on the Cottonwood Valley, a proper sitting room with a fireplace, and a study that Lavinia appropriated entirely for her books and papers and her continuing journal, which by 1889 filled 4 volumes and showed no sign of stopping. Homer had a desk in the corner of the sitting room that suited him fine. Thomas, now 8 years old, had a room of his own that he immediately covered in hand-drawn maps of the ranch property, marking the locations of every hawk nest he had identified. Clara Ruth, 3 years old, had the room next door and conducted a relentless campaign to be in Thomas's room as often as possible, which Thomas endured with the resigned affection of an older sibling who has given up fighting the inevitable. The 3rd child was born in October of 1889, another boy, born in the new house in the room that had the best light, whom they named James Homer Ramsey, James for no particular reason except that it suited him the moment they said it, and Homer because Lavinia looked at her son's face and said, "He is absolutely going to be exactly like you," which Homer received with a quiet pride that was one of the most purely happy expressions she had ever seen on his face. James Homer Ramsey was, as advertised, exactly like his father. He was quiet and observant, and had a quality of stillness at an age when most children are in constant motion that made strangers ask if he was unwell, and made Lavinia and Homer exchange the private smile of parents who know their child entirely. He watched everything and forgot nothing, and by the time he was 2, he had already demonstrated the particular gentleness with animals that would eventually make him, years later, even better at the horse work than his father. Caldwell in 1890 was a different town than the one Lavinia had stepped off the stage into 11 years before. The great cattle drives were history now, the trails closed by the fences and farms that had spread across the plains, and the town was finding its new character, quieter and more settled, with a newspaper and a proper bank and a hotel that had curtains in the windows and a menu. The wildness was not gone, but it had retreated somewhat, become more occasional, more a memory that old-timers told about with a nostalgia that mingled pride and wistfulness in equal measure. Lavinia's school had grown into something she was genuinely proud of. She had 2 teachers working under her now, Clara Finch, and a young man named Robert Alston, who had come from a teacher's college in Lawrence, and the building itself had been expanded twice and now had 3 rooms and a proper outhouse, and a well of its own. Several of her earliest students had grown up, and some of them had children of their own beginning to appear in the classroom, which created the particular continuous pleasure of watching what you plant come up season after season. Del Pryor, now 23 and working the family land north of Caldwell, stopped in to see her that autumn with his hat in his hands and told her that he wanted to thank her for teaching him to love reading because it had changed his life, and that he had named his firstborn son after her father whose name she had mentioned once in a history lesson. She cried, which she felt was entirely justified. Edna Pryor was 71 and still possessed of her opinions, now delivered from a rocking chair that Homer had built for her 68th birthday, positioned on her porch to maximize the observation of Main Street. She came to the new house for Sunday dinner twice a month, and presided over the table with the benevolent authority of a woman who has been right about everything important for a very long time. In the summer of 1891, Homer turned 42. Lavinia organized a gathering at the ranch house that drew more people than she had expected, which was to say that she had expected many people and even more came, because Homer had in 12 years built not just a ranch, but a community of regard around himself without ever trying to or being aware of it, through the simple means of being reliable and kind and honest in every transaction, large and small. Tomás Vargas, now the ranch foreman and a man whose authority on the Cimarron Flats equaled Homer's in everything except the title, gave a speech that made Homer stare at the ground in the particular way he did when he was feeling something too large to look at directly. Luis Vargas, who had married a woman from the Cherokee Nation the previous year and now lived on the property south of the ranch, contributed an amount of food to the party that was somewhat legendary. Thomas, 11 years old and already as tall as Lavinia's shoulder, stood next to his father during the speech with the same focused stillness, and Lavinia stood a little apart and watched the two of them together with a happiness so full it pressed against her ribs. Clara Ruth, 5 years old and entirely her own person, had decided that the party was an appropriate occasion for a performance and had been practicing a song about a mockingbird for 2 weeks. She delivered it standing on a fence post with a seriousness that reduced half the adults present to delighted helpless laughter, which she received with a gracious nod that she must have been practicing in the mirror. James Homer, who was 21 months old and had very decided feelings about the proceedings, spent most of the party in his father's arms observing everything with the careful amber-brown eyes he had inherited without any obvious negotiation. Lavinia caught Homer's eye across the yard in the afternoon, over the heads of their children and neighbors and friends, across the space of a dozen years and everything that had filled them, and he looked at her with that look she had no words for still, that discovery look, and she pressed her hand to her heart once without thinking about it, which made him smile the smile that changed everything. After the party, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together on the back porch of the new house looking out at the Cottonwood Valley in the darkness, listening to the creek run and the night insects and the distant sound of the horses moving in the paddock. The sky was enormous above the valley, thick with stars in the way that only the deep country sky can be, uninterrupted and immeasurable. 42, she said. It is a good number, he said. 12 of it spent with you. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Are you happy? He was quiet in the way he always was when he was taking a question seriously. She loved him for that still, after all the years, the refusal to give any answer less than the true one. Happy is not the right word, he said at last. Happy is what you feel at a party or when a good thing happens. This is something more permanent than that. This is where I am supposed to be, and I know it every day. She thought about that for a long moment, listening to the creek and the stars and the sleeping house behind them. I thought when I got on that stage in Missouri, she said, that I was running away from something. I thought about it as an escape. She paused. I understand now that I was running toward this. I just did not know the word for it yet. He put his arm around her, and she tucked herself into the familiar space of it, and the valley held them in its quiet, and the stars went on overhead, indifferent and magnificent. The years that followed were years of harvest, in the truest sense of that word. The horse operation on the Ramsey Ranch became the best in the county and one of the best in the state, with a reputation that drew buyers from as far as Colorado and buyers representing government interests from the east. Homer worked with the same steady purpose as always, but he worked now with the confidence of a man who has found his right work and knows it. And the land responded to that confidence in the straightforward way that the land always does, by producing. Thomas, in his early teens, had begun to demonstrate a talent for the horsework that surpassed even Homer's expectations. Not the physical talent, though he had that too, but the intuitive quality of understanding what a horse needed before the horse had fully expressed it. Homer taught him everything he knew, and then had the unusual experience of watching his son exceed the lesson. Clara Ruth grew up loud and laughing and entirely unimpressed by the things that were supposed to impress girls in the 1890s Kansas plains, more interested in the horses than in the social accomplishments that Lavinia taught at school, which gave Lavinia a private amusement and a parental pride she was careful not to show too obviously. Clara Ruth at 10 was already riding better than half the ranch hands and had decided views on the quality of the horses they selected for purchase, views that Homer listened to with a respect that delighted her and confounded the occasional buyer who arrived expecting the rancher to be the only authority present. James Homer, quiet and deep like his father, developed a healer's quality with the animals by the time he was 7, a patience and a gentleness that made sick horses calm in his presence, and that even the most difficult new purchases responded to. Tomás Vargas told Homer once that the boy had a gift, and Homer had said, "I know," with the simple acknowledgement of a parent who sees their child clearly and is grateful for what they see. In the spring of 1895, something arrived in the mail that opened a new conversation. It was a letter from the county school board in Wichita, offering Lavinia the position of district superintendent for the schools of the southern county, which would have her overseeing not just the Caldwell school but 5 others across the district. It was an unprecedented offer for a woman in that time and place, and it came with the language of an institution that knew it was doing something unusual and was being careful about how it framed it. She brought the letter to Homer that evening and set it on the supper table between them. He read it carefully twice, with the focused attention he gave to any document that mattered. Then he set it down and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he asked, and there was nothing in the question but genuine inquiry. No position, no preference that had not been asked for, no shadow of what answer he wanted. She had been thinking about it all day, and she had a clear answer. "I want to take it," she said, "but only if we can manage the travel and the children's needs between us. Thomas is old enough to be a real help around the ranch. And I would not be traveling constantly, more overseeing and organizing than daily presence in the schools." Homer was quiet for a moment. "The Vargas brothers are here. The ranch runs well. Thomas is 15 and worth 3 hands." He paused. "You have been preparing for something like this your whole life without knowing it, just like I was running toward the ranch. Take the position." She took the position. The next 5 years were the most professionally demanding and fulfilling of her career, and the balance they found as a family to accommodate it was both difficult and deeply instructive. Homer took on more of the domestic management without fanfare or complaint, managing the household's organization with the same practical efficiency he brought to the ranch. And there was never a day when she came home from a long drive to a district school to find anything but a house that was functioning and children who were cared for, and a husband who was glad to see her and interested in what she had found. She supervised the expansion of 4 school buildings and the hiring of 9 new teachers and the introduction of a curriculum standard that became, in time, a model for the broader state effort. She was 40 years old when she started and 45 when she completed her tenure. And she did it in the particular way she did everything, with full attention and no performance, and a genuine love for what she was doing that made the work itself the reward. Homer turned 50 in 1899, and the century was turning too, and the old Wild West that had been the world of their arriving was now a thing that people were beginning to write books about, a historical era already a legend being shaped into a shape that simplified what had actually been there. Lavinia thought about this sometimes, about the complexity of what the plains had been, and what they had cost the people who were already there when the settlers arrived, about the cattle drives and the trail towns, and the particular violence and beauty of a world that was now, in the language of 1899, the recent past. She taught about it in her school visits, not with nostalgia but with honesty, not simplifying the shadows or dimming the light, trying to give the children of Caldwell a true account of the world their parents and grandparents had come into. Homer, at 50, was still the same man she had met on the station platform in 1879, only more so, more fully himself, the lines deeper and the quietness deeper and the amber eyes unchanged. He had added gray at his temples, which suited him, and a slight stiffness in his left shoulder from a fall with a horse 10 years before that he managed so habitually. She only noticed it when the cold came in. On the last evening of the century, December 31st of 1899, they sat together in the sitting room of the Cottonwood Valley house with Thomas, now 19 and already the primary operator of the horse side of the ranch, and Clara Ruth, 13 and ferocious, and James Homer, 10 years old and serious as ever, and a fire in the fireplace, and the whole family gathered in the way that families are when they know they are in a moment worth marking. "A new century," Thomas said, with the gravity of a young man who takes things seriously. "The old one was not bad," Homer said. "The old one was excellent," Lavinia said firmly. "But I expect the new one to be even better." Clara Ruth looked up from the horse blanket she was repairing at the table because she was always doing something with her hands. "What will be different?" "Everything," Lavinia said, "and nothing essential." James Homer had not said anything yet. He was sitting on the floor near the fire with his back against the stone hearth, watching the flames with the contained attention that was his entire personality. Then he said, without looking up, "I think the horses will still need the same things." Homer laughed, a real laugh, and leaned across the settee and took Lavinia's hand. She looked at him in the firelight, at the man she had loved for 20 years and would love for 20 more and beyond that, until there was no more time to measure it in, and she thought about a stagecoach and a Kansas wind and a hat blowing across a main street into the hands of a man who had been standing there as though he had been waiting. "Yes," she said, squeezing his hand. "The important things will need the same things." The new century arrived with snow, which fell quietly over the Cottonwood Valley in the first hour of 1900, and the family went out onto the back porch and looked at the white world being made and breathed the cold, clean air. And Homer put his arm around Lavinia and she leaned into him, and the children stood around them in the dark, and the snow came down out of a sky full of stars. Life on the Cimarron Flats in the first decade of the new century was the kind of life that a person does not always appreciate while it is happening because it is simply too steady and too good. The kind that you look back on later with the fullness of understanding that only distance provides. The ranch was thriving. The children were growing. The love between Homer and Lavinia was so established and so woven through the fabric of every day that it was no longer distinguishable from the life itself, had become the thing that the life was made of. Thomas married in 1903 a woman named Pearl from Wichita, who came to the ranch with a directness and a humor that made Lavinia love her on the first afternoon, and made Homer say to Lavinia that evening, "She will do," which from Homer was the equivalent of a declaration of deep and unconditional approval. The wedding was held at the ranch under the cottonwood trees, in October when the leaves were gold, and if it reminded Lavinia of her own wedding day, it was because happiness has a consistency that runs through all its occasions, a quality that is recognizable each time you encounter it, like a voice you have always known. Pearl was expecting by the following spring, and Thomas came to tell Homer the news with the same combination of elation and slight overwhelm that Homer had felt 23 years before in a kitchen by the window, and Homer received it with the understanding of a man who has been there himself. "You will be fine," Homer told him. "Better than fine." "How did you know?" Thomas asked. Homer looked at his son for a moment. "I did not know ahead of time," he said. "You find out by doing it." Thomas's first child was born in November of 1904, a boy they named Owen, and the particular happiness of becoming grandparents arrived for Homer and Lavinia with a warmth that was entirely its own, different from the happiness of their own children, wider and more relaxed, the happiness of people who have already done the hard and wonderful work and now get to stand nearby while someone they love does it themselves. Clara Ruth, at 19, was running a significant portion of the horse purchasing and training operation, having demonstrated over several years that her instincts about horses were commercially valuable, and her negotiating manner with buyers was something between a freight train and a force of nature. She had no interest yet in marriage, having told her mother plainly at 17 that she had things to do first, and Lavinia had said, "Good," which was not what Clara had expected but was exactly right. James Homer, at 15, had grown into a young man of such quiet depth and competence that the ranch hands treated him with a respect that sometimes surprised visiting buyers who met him, and initially assumed he was just the rancher's youngest boy. He had his father's face now, more clearly every year, and his mother's intelligence in the eyes, and he was, Lavinia thought, the synthesis of both of them in a way that Thomas and Clara, wonderful as they were, had not quite been. He was their third effort at the attempt, and he had come out entirely his own person, which was the best possible result. In 1907, Homer had a health scare that rearranged the family's life for several months. It was his heart, a warning rather than a crisis, but a warning that the doctor in Wichita delivered with the solemnity that such things require, and Homer received it in the characteristically direct way he received everything, sitting across the desk and listening with his full attention and asking the right questions. He came home and told Lavinia that evening with the same directness, sitting at the kitchen table and laying out what the doctor had said with the clarity of a man who does not believe in softening facts that need to be faced. She sat across from him and listened, and when he had finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she reached across the table and took both his hands. "We are going to do exactly what the doctor says," she said, "all of it without argument." "I know," he said. "Homer," she held his hands more tightly, "I need you to understand that I am not equipped to do this without you." He looked at her with those eyes. "Lavinia," he said, "you are equipped for absolutely anything, but I also intend to be here." He followed the doctor's guidance with the same thorough commitment he brought to everything, adjusting what needed to be adjusted in his daily work, allowing Thomas and James to take on the heavier physical demands without the extended negotiation of pride that the same circumstance would have cost another man. He was helped in this by the fact that he had no ego invested in being needed for the work. What he was invested in was the work being done well, and it was by his sons, and that was sufficient. By 1908, he was stable and the doctors were satisfied, and he had settled into a pace that suited the season of life he was in, still present and still the center of the ranch's intelligence if not its daily physical labor, teaching James the things that only time produces and that cannot be written down. Lavinia, at 53, had by now become something of a legend in the county school system, a woman who had shaped the education of a generation of Plains children, and who was still, to everyone's mild astonishment, not tired of it. She had reduced her formal administrative role after Homer's health scare, because no position was worth what distance cost, but she continued to teach 1 day a week in the Caldwell school, her name still on the chalkboard in careful letters, because she found that she needed the classroom the way some people need a church, as a place where something essential about the world was regularly demonstrated. Clara Ruth married in 1909, at 23. A horse buyer from Abilene named George Holt, who had come to the ranch in the spring to look at their stock, and had spent 3 hours arguing with Clara about the evaluation criteria for a young quarter horse, and had left with the horse and a determination to come back, which he did 6 more times that year, each time officially to look at horses, and actually to argue with Clara about horses, which was, everyone on the ranch understood, the Holt family courtship in its entirety. They married in June at the ranch, again under the cottonwood trees, and it was the second wedding the valley had held, and it was good, as weddings are when the people involved have chosen each other on the basis of genuine knowledge. James Homer Ramsey, 20 years old in 1909, was by then in full command of the horse breeding program that had become the ranch's primary reputation, and he had in his quiet way also begun to write down what he knew, not for publication, but for the keeping of it, the particular knowledge of these Plains horses and what they needed, and how they thought, compiled with the careful observation of someone who has been watching closely since before he could articulate what he was watching. He would eventually, in years beyond this story, publish a small book that would be read by horse people in 4 states, but that lay ahead. Homer and Lavinia had now been married for 30 years, and if the celebration of it was quieter than the original occasion, it was more complete. They sat together on the back porch of the Cottonwood Valley house on a November evening and watched the sky go through its evening transformation, from blue to gold to rose to gray to the first dark blue of night, and the valley was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a place that has been filled with life and is resting. 30 years, Lavinia said. Not enough, Homer said. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the sky with the easy attention of a man at peace with where he is, and the gray at his temples had spread further and his face had the deep weathering of a lifetime under open sky, and she loved him with the totality of someone who has had time to love every version. No, she agreed. Not nearly enough. Then we will need another 30, he said. We had better get started, she said. He turned to look at her and smiled the smile, the one she had been watching change his face for 30 years, and it was still the same smile, still the one that made the sun come out, and she pressed her hand to his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady and present, and the valley held them and the stars began. Owen Ramsey, Thomas's son, who was 5 years old now and had Homer's eyes, came running out of the house at that moment with Clara's youngest in his wake, because family gatherings had a way of generating their own momentum, and the children always found each other, and he skidded to a stop when he saw his grandparents on the porch. "Grandpa," he said. "James says supper is almost ready." "Thank you, Owen," Homer said with all seriousness. Owen studied them both for a moment with the evaluative gaze of a very small person who suspects he has interrupted something but is not sure what. Then he turned and ran back inside, the screen door banging behind him with the particular sound of a house that is fully lived in. Homer and Lavinia looked at each other. "Supper is almost ready," she said. "It is," he said. They sat a moment more in the last light, together in the way they had always been, in the way the land was together with the sky, in the way the creek was together with its banks, in the full and permanent and chosen way of 2 people who have built their life as carefully and honestly as a good house and who intend to live in it, every room of it, for as long as there is time. The cottonwood leaves came down around the porch in the still evening air, yellow as September, and the spring ran in the valley below, and somewhere on the far side of the paddock, a horse called once in the gathering dark, and the house behind them was full of the sound of the people they had made, talking and laughing and setting the table for supper. Homer stood and held out his hand to her, and she took it, and they went inside.